Good evening, everyone. İyi akşamlar. My name is Jennifer Anderson. I am the Deputy Head of Mission, Müsteşarım, at the British Embassy. And I am here both personally because I am very much looking forward to this lecture, but also on behalf of our ambassador, Richard Moore, who is completing his last working hours in Turkey at the moment, but otherwise would have very much wanted to be here, and I promised him I would be here on his behalf. It gives me enormous pleasure to introduce Professor Ian Hodder. I say introduce, but I suspect that most of you know quite a bit about him, so I feel like the opening rather than the introduction. But given all that he has done here in Turkey and for the development of archaeology, I do want to introduce him in some detail, if you will allow me. So perhaps I start by saying that, as you all know, Professor Ian Hodder is one of the most eminent prehistoric archaeologists to come out of the United Kingdom. He is currently the Dunlevie Family Professor of Anthropology at Stanford University, but his American base was preceded by a very distinguished career in the UK and many, many years here in Turkey, I think 25 in total. But perhaps if I can give you a little bit of that detail. Professor Hodder studied his BA in prehistoric archaeology at the Institute of Archaeology at London University between 1968 and 1971. And then he undertook research leading to a PhD at Cambridge University on the subject of spatial analysis in archaeology. He then went on to be a lecturer in the Department of Archaeology at the University of Leeds, and then again at the University of Cambridge, and ultimately a reader in prehistory and a professor of archaeology in Cambridge. He was made a Fellow of the British Academy in 1996, and in 1999 became the Professor of Anthropology at the Department of Anthropology at Stanford University, and the co-director and director of the Archaeology Center at Stanford University. Professor Hodder has received a significant number of fellowships and visiting professorships in many universities in the UK, Cambridge, as I mentioned, the University College London and Oxford, and also abroad, including Amsterdam, Paris at the Sorbonne, Stanford in the United States, Koç University here in Turkey, and ANAMED. And he has also received many prizes and awards, which I will not attempt to list all of them, but I will single out two, of which in 2017, the Fyssen Foundation International Prize in Paris and the Innovation in Academia Award, Arts and Culture at the University of Kent in the United Kingdom. And I think Lute, our director here, was very keen that I particularly emphasize the innovation side because it is the theoretical innovation in archaeology for which Professor Hodder is particularly known in the field, but also obviously the field work that he's done here in Turkey, above all at Çatalhöyük. That field work has taken place since 1993. It was a 25-year project, and it had three aims, and those were to place the site and the art from the site in its full environmental, economic and social context, to conserve the paintings, the plasters and mud walls, and to present the site to the public. And the project has been associated with attempts to develop reflexive methods in archaeology. And if I might just briefly note those who have funded it, which has included the British Academy and the British Institute in Ankara for the full 25 years of the project, along with National Geographic Society, National Science Foundation, the European Union, MacDonald Archaeological Fund, Stanford University, the Newton Trust, Templeton Foundation, the Global Heritage Fund, the World Monument Fund, the Kaplan Trust, Imatio, and by a range of private and corporate investors and sponsors. And perhaps that long list of funding reflects the significance of the site, and clearly that was acknowledged internationally when it was listed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2012. So at this point I'm already feeling well intimidated, but I will briefly list some of Professor Hodder's main publications, and they include Symbols in Action, Cambridge University Press 1982, Reading in the Past, again Cambridge University Press 1986, The Domestication of Europe, Oxford University Press 1990, The Archaeological Process, Oxford University Press 1999, Çatalhöyük, The Leopard's Tale, Thames and Hudson, and Entangled, an archaeology of the relationships between human beings and things. With that very distinguished lineage, I know he's got a great deal to say, and we're all very much looking forward to it. So on that note, may I please invite Professor Hodder to come and give his lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and I really wanted to use the opportunity of this talk to thank the British Embassy and the British Institute at Ankara for their support of the project over a very long period of time. It would have been quite impossible to do this without their generous and unstinting support. And I'm particularly grateful to Lut and to Guggen for the way that they have given me what I needed, often in very difficult times. So thank you very much, and this is a wonderful occasion to say thank you to you. And at the end of my talk I'll say some other thanks, but that's for me the most important one. So I'm going to talk today about the 25 years of research that we've done at Çatalhöyük, and I'll try and be brief because it's getting very hot in here, and we need to get out into the air again. Of course, all archaeologists are in a way involved in a backward-looking curiosity. It's just a definition of what archaeology is. But I have a particular meaning I want to give to this phrase, because over the 25 years it's been very interesting to me how our ideas have changed as the techniques have changed and as we've done more research. And I find that a very fascinating aspect of archaeology, that we tend to think that, we dig a site and we come up with some answer and that's it. Whereas over a long-term project, what you find is that that's not it, that things keep changing. And in fact, the more you know about a site, the less you know about it, and the more and more questions that you have. So I'm interested in, one of the things I want to do in this talk is to show how, if we look backward over the 25 years, how theories and ideas have changed. Another aspect of this backward-looking curiosity is about Çatalhöyük itself. And so one of the things that I will be saying is that the people at Çatalhöyük 8,000 to 9,000 years ago also had a backward-looking curiosity, very different from our own, but they were nevertheless very interested in history and development and change through time. So this is an image of Çatalhöyük, which is dated, as I said, to about 8,000 to 9,000 years ago, and is associated with these two mounds. Far I can go. The two mounds, the west mound here and the east mound here. This is the main Neolithic mound that I'm going to be talking about. And our main excavations have taken place in the North Shelter and in the South Shelter. This is a view of the work recently in the North Shelter. And this is a view of the work recently in the South Shelter, and I'll come back to these later. Over the 25 years of our work, there have been many changes. Perhaps one of the most obvious changes is that we started back in '93 with a very small team, but the team more recently has become very large, very international, with about 150, 160 people working at the site in the summers. So the team has got bigger. The other big change over the 25 years has been the change in techniques. So when we were starting in 93, we were still writing everything down on paper. As we move through time, we now do all our recording without paper, using tablets. Everything is digitized and all the recording is done in a digital way, and we now can interact with the data in a virtual environment as well. So the techniques have changed totally. But I'm not going to talk about that, although I'm very happy to answer questions about those sorts of changes afterwards. I want instead to focus on 5 areas of our research where our ideas have changed over time. And I'm going to be looking at landscape and environment, changes in ideas about burial and the use of houses, about social organization, and about women, the mother goddess, and figurines. So the first topic is landscape and environment. So when we started work in the 90s, a group of people led by Neil Roberts did a whole series of cores around the mound, not very many cores, but a few cores down into the landscape around the Neolithic mound. And they found a lot of deposits of what they thought were back swamp clays, so clays that had been deposited in a very wet, boggy environment. And so they reconstructed the landscape of Çatalhöyük as being in a floodplain that was very wet, particularly in the springtime, but was really very wet throughout the year. And this is a reconstruction of the way that we understood Çatalhöyük in 1993, or in the 90s. So I thought this was really good, strong scientific work, and I really believed this. And it led to a big problem, however, which was that the evidence from cereals, the type of cereals that were grown and the type of phytoliths, the silica skeletons in the cereal, and the weed assemblages all suggested that the plants, the cereals, had been grown on dry land. And so it was not possible that the cereals were grown near Çatalhöyük. And so we came up with the idea that people lived at Çatalhöyük, but they farmed their fields 12 kilometers away on dry land, on higher, drier land. This does not make a lot of sense, but nevertheless I believed all the science, and this is what we came up with. But it really did not make a lot of sense, because how could you have, we think maybe 8,000 people lived at Çatalhöyük. It just seems ridiculous that they would go 12 kilometers to their fields. So more recently, we got a new team in, and this is something I found many times. If you get new people in, they always have new ideas. They like to overturn the ideas of previous people. And so the new team wanted to argue against the old idea, and I'm afraid you can't see this very well, but they did many more cores over a much wider area around Çatalhöyük to study the sedimentological sequence. And what they found was that there was a much more complex environment in the Neolithic that had gradually got covered up in the millennia since then, but that older Neolithic landscape was one that looked much more like these dendritic patterns that are found in various parts of the world today. And so they argue that the sequence of occupation the sequence of the landscape change at Çatalhöyük was that initially there was a river that gradually became more and more dendritic, and then in the time of Çatalhöyük, this is Çatalhöyük here, you have this very complex dendritic system, but where there are dry areas between the streams and in between these dendritic patterns. And then that same dendritic pattern continues on when the Neolithic mound is abandoned and the West mound is constructed. So this is a very different model, and this allows the fields of Çatalhöyük to be right near Çatalhöyük. So this is a much more sensible idea, and it seems to fit much more of the evidence more effectively. So it's interesting that if we had stopped Çatalhöyük 15 years ago, that earlier idea would have been the dominant idea that got accepted and published and used. But it's only by doing more research that you find that you change your ideas and a new picture emerges. And I suppose if we carry on and if we were to carry on and do further research in the future, this pattern too would get changed. So it's important to recognize the way that ideas get changed through time. And the same is true, perhaps even more, with my second topic, which is burial. So I'm sure you're all aware of these famous images from Çatalhöyük of what are supposed to be vultures, or people dressed up as vultures, taking the flesh off headless corpses. And so when James Mallard excavated the site in the 1960s, he interpreted the human remains at Çatalhöyük in terms of this sort of idea. And the way that Mallard excavated in the 1960s was to go straight through the floors of the houses, and underneath the floors he found this great jumble of bodies. And he assumed that these bodies had been originally left out in the open, and then the flesh had been taken off by vultures, and then the bodies had been placed beneath the floors of the houses. However, when the new team started in the 90s, they noticed some rather different things. For example, they noticed that in many cases the burials were put in proper graves that had been cut down from the floors. These are the floors of the houses, and graves had been cut and the bodies placed in them. And many of the burials are like this. They also noticed that all of the body parts were present, even the small fingers and toes. And if the bodies had been left out to be scavenged by vultures, you would not expect the small bones to survive into the graves. And also they found no evidence on the bones of the marks that might have been left by the beaks of the vultures as they consumed the flesh. Because all the different parts of the body, even the small parts, were present, they argued that these bodies were placed in here with flesh on, that they were just normal burials of flesh bodies that were placed in the graves. And the reason that you appear to get a jumble of bones is because people add in later graves into the same part of the floor of the house. So originally there's one grave, and then people they fill it up, and then later they add make another hole and add more bodies, and gradually through time you get a lot of bodies that appear to be all jumbled, but at any one time each body is put in fleshed. So each body is put in with its flesh on. So that was the idea that developed in the 90s and in the 2000s, and became the sort of dominant accepted view about burial at Çatalhöyük. In addition, there was clear evidence of secondary removal of bones. So for example, there are examples where the skull has been removed from the body, and we assumed during that period that the body was placed in the grave, and then after perhaps a year or two people went down, and if they wanted to they would dig down, and then they would cut off the head and take it and use it in various ways. Here's an example here where the skull, taken from another body, has been placed in a grave with a woman. So in fact these are a woman holding the skull of another woman, and the face of this woman has been reconstructed in plaster in the Neolithic. So there's clearly evidence of secondary movement of bone, and there are lots of examples of this now. So for example, this is an earlier building. There was a grave here, which you see here, and then in this later building they took some of the bones from this grave and they placed it in this later grave. So we have lots of these types of examples where people take bones from an earlier period or from an earlier building and put it into a later building. So this is a type of secondary burial. So for a long time we accepted this idea, but then again I asked a new team to come to Çatalhöyük, and this new team wanted to change everything and come up with its own ideas, and so they attacked this idea and they came up with some new evidence. So this is the new group here, and one of the things that they noticed most clearly was that some of the burials seemed to be flexed very, very tightly. So tightly that it seems unlikely you could do that with a fleshed body. There's something seemed to be wrong. How was it possible to flex these bodies so very tightly if they had all their flesh on? So that was one problem. Another issue that became very clear was that many of the bodies, much more than we understood earlier, had been very carefully wrapped. They had been wrapped in a whole range of different types of skin and cloth, so very tightly bundled. But also in sort of chemical and microscopic analysis of the bones, the histological analysis of the bones, it became clear that these bodies were not in fact buried immediately. They had been left out in some way before they were buried. So a new theory emerged, which is that after death these bodies were wrapped and they were left to dry in some way. We don't know where, but they were left out to dry in some way, and then they were more tightly wrapped and then placed in these graves at a later point, well after death. So this is a sort of desiccation or even sort of mummification that was going on in order to have these bodies buried in this sort of way. Of course, it's still the case that people could remove arms and legs. Here's a torso from which the arms and legs have been removed, and these are other examples where the head has been removed. And we know that arms and legs and heads were circulated in Çatalhöyük. So if you visited Çatalhöyük and you visited houses, there would be perhaps bundled bodies or skulls or arms and legs that were lying around or in houses. And so this was part of daily life, to have the bodies of the dead present. And then ultimately, as the body, as the flesh decayed, the bodies would be put in the graves and parts would be taken out and circulated. So this is a very different type of view, and there is even an article that has just been written by this group where they say that it's possible that some of the burials at Çatalhöyük were left out for vultures. So we're back with Mellart, and they say that because there has been new research studying the behavior of vultures, and it turns out that vultures are able to remove the flesh from carcasses without disturbing the bones very much. So the fact that we have all parts of the body present may fit with their having been exposed by and the flesh eaten by vultures. In fact, there is no definite evidence that this is true. There's no definite evidence that vultures were involved at Çatalhöyük. But this new team are saying that it's possible. It is possible, and given the artistic evidence, we have to accept that that may be possible. Probably not for all burials, but for some of the skeletons at Çatalhöyük. So again, you see how ideas change. They go round in circles. You have new teams come along, and as I said before, if you stop the process at some point, you would get one view of Çatalhöyük. But if you let the research carry on, you get a different view. It's very, very unstable. The third area that I want to look at, how ideas have changed over the last 25 years, is about the use of houses. So when Mellart excavated Çatalhöyük in the 1960s, he argued that some of these buildings, at least, were shrines. He thought that because they had a great concentration of ritual symbolism in them, and because the floors were very, very clean, that these were probably not used as normal houses, but as special shrines. And he called them shrines. For example, here you can't see this, but this is Shrine 6A. There were other buildings that he thought were houses, but some of them he thought were shrines. The work that we started doing in the 90s and 2000s, particularly the work by Wendy Matthews looking at micromorphology, the sort of detailed micromorphological analysis of the soils and the floors and the wall plasters, showed that in fact there was a lot of evidence at the microscopic level of activity in the houses. It certainly is the case that normally at Çatalhöyük people swept the floors very carefully and the floors look initially very clean. But if you look under the microscope, you find a huge amount of evidence of activities, reed fighters, charred remains, rake out from the ovens and the hearth, evidence of production of bone tools and wooden tools and so on. So lots and lots of evidence of daily life and production inside the houses, particularly at the southern end of the house, where the hearth and oven is. In Çatalhöyük, the houses always have a southern end where the hearth and oven is, and then the northern end where you have the burial and more of the ritual. And especially in the southern end, there's lots and lots of evidence of activity. And if you look again on the walls of the houses, Wendy Matthews studied the layers of plaster on the walls, because the people would replaster, put new fresh plaster on the walls, sometimes hundreds of times during the course of the life of the building. And if she looked in the detailed layers of plaster on the walls, she found lots of evidence of soot, indicating that through the life of the building there was a build-up of soot in the building as a result of using fires and so on. So it became clear that in fact these buildings were used, that they were not just religious places, they were lived-in places. And by studying, you see again the sort of the concentration of micro-artifacts in the southern part of the building. In some cases, the buildings were abandoned in a different way by burning the building, and in those cases we find lots of artifacts on the floor. And the work by the archaeobotanists at Çatalhöyük has provided very fascinating details about how life was organized. Here you have a building where the hearths and ovens are on the south, and you have these bull's horns in the north, the northern ritual area, and the burials in the north. These are the storage bins. This is the side room, the side storage room. And by very careful, detailed analysis of the archaeobotanical charred remains in this burned building, they were able to show that the crops, a wide range of crops, mainly cereals and wheat and barley, were stored in these bins after initial processing outside, but they still had the chaff. They still needed to be winnowed and pounded. And we found outside the bins that people would do the initial pounding to remove the chaff from the grain, and we found traces of this activity around grinding stone here. And then people would take the cleaned grain into the main room, and they would grind it to make flour by the oven, and then throw the remains into the hearth. And so we can see very nicely how on a daily basis people would go in, get grains, dehusk them, grind them, and make bread. We have evidence of the bread that was made. So it is a fascinating insight, the details. You can imagine people going backwards and forwards every day in the storage and southern part of the house. So lots and lots of evidence. And this is a type of building that Mellart would have called a shrine, because it has these bull's horns in it. So lots of evidence of daily activity. And I don't know whether this is going to work. Probably not. Oh, it is. It's working. Yeah. So this is one of these virtual reconstructions. And my point of showing it is that you have all this ritual stuff in the north part of the house, but you have the ladder in the south part, and it's underneath the ladder that you have the hearth and oven, and it's these floors here that we call dirty floors, because they have a large amount of microscopic evidence of activity of daily life and production of stone tools, bone tools, wooden tools, and so on, all part of a daily access. But this is also happening within these buildings that are sometimes very elaborate symbolically. So we've seen there how our ideas about the use of these houses has changed through time. The next topic I want to look at is, for me, one of the most interesting aspects of Çatalhöyük, and I think for many people, one of the most interesting aspects, because Çatalhöyük is a site of maybe 8,000 people, as I said before. How was that organized socially at this time period? How do you manage 8,000 people living very tightly together in a community like this? And so what was the social organization? So James Mellart in the 1960s argued that he had probably excavated an area of the site where there were special buildings and where there was a priestly caste, a group of priests who somehow managed and ruled or organized Çatalhöyük. So for him it was a sort of centralized society, one with clear hierarchy, in which these religious priest-like figures were dominant. So he saw it as a hierarchical society. One of the things that we have been able to do at Çatalhöyük, particularly working in the SAS shelter, is to look at the way that individual houses change through time. And one of the clearest types of evidence that we have is that individual houses were often built on top of each other over time. So people would live in one house for maybe 50 or 100 years. They would then fill it in and then build another house on top for maybe another 50 or 100 years. They would fill that one in and then build another one on top in long sequences. And there was often a lot of continuity. For example, see this dog leg at the top in all of these houses, and the hearth and oven in the same place, and the burial patterns in the same place, and so on. So a lot of evidence of continuity in buildings. And you can see this here in this section, or in fact you can't really see it. it's not very clear. I'm sorry, it doesn't come out on this slide. But these are sequences of houses that go up through here, where you have 5 or 6 times the same house repeated and rebuilt in the same location. And it's not just that the houses are in the same location, but also that they do the same sorts of things. So this is one house here, and this is another house directly above it. And you can see that on the north wall there are these pairs of leopards, and in exactly the same position in the building above there are pairs of leopards. So this suggests clearly a sort of continuity of activity in the same place, the same building. And what's more, we have evidence of people going down and collecting artifacts, and particularly sculptures from earlier buildings. So here's an example of a building, and after it was abandoned, people dug a hole down and they removed a sculpture from the wall there. And here's an example where this is a foundation pit for a post in a house, and at the bottom of the post is a human skull. So people had collected a human skull and from an earlier building and placed it in the foundation trench for a post when they were constructing the new building. So there is a lot of evidence of what you might call history making, and this is this example of a backward-looking curiosity that I mentioned earlier. That this is a backward-looking curiosity in the Neolithic, that people were going back in time and collecting objects and repeating objects and reusing those in later buildings. So they're sort of creating histories through time. So you get lineages of houses that are all connected through time. These houses that have a lot of evidence of history making, of repeating things through time, are also the houses that have most burials. And again, you probably can't really see this, but these are the down here are the houses that have larger amounts of repetition of the same use of the same house over time. And what you see is that the number of burials here increases as the length of occupation of these houses increases. So that suggests that there are some houses at Çatalhöyük that are rebuilt many times. There's a lot of evidence of history making. They tend to be more elaborate because they're bringing back these artifacts from the past, the bull's heads and other sorts of features from the past. And they also have more burial. So it's another form of history making by building up genealogies of people in these houses. And these are the houses that Mellart would have called shrines. So what we are now seeing is that these are not really just shrines, these are houses that are built by constructing lineages through time. So in order to understand that better, I want to talk a little bit about the spatial organization, and this is something that we've been able to look at more carefully in the north area of the site, where we've been able to look at the arrangement of houses at one period of time, and this shows a plan of the houses. You can't see some of the buildings over here, but of course this is just one part of the mound as a whole, where we've been excavating in the north area. So the question was, is this pattern found all over the site? And of course it's much too big a site to excavate entirely, but we've done a lot of survey of different types on the mound, including ground penetrating radar, and what that has shown is that we get very similar types of houses across the whole mound. So this is the area we were looking at before, where we've done the excavation. It's very difficult to see these mud brick walled houses in a mud brick on a mud brick tell. It's very difficult for the ground penetrating radar to pick out walls, but nevertheless it's clear from this that as far as we can see, the whole mound is just made up of this very dense packing of houses. And if we look at this pattern of houses, what's clear is that some houses are quite big. But look at this one, for example, quite a big house here, or this one here. But some of them are very small. This little one in here, or this little one there. Or this is a little house here, stuck in between other houses. So that there's clearly big differences in the size of the house. So you might think, the big houses are the houses of the elite, and these must be the houses of these history houses, the houses with many burials and with much elaborate symbolism. But in fact, that's not what happens. So if you plot the size of the house against the elaboration of the house, which means how much symbolism there is in the house, or if you plot the size against the number of burials, there is no relationship. So it is not the case that at Çatalhöyük, the more elaborate houses with more burials are the big houses. The more elaborate houses with more burials can be very small, and very large houses can have very few burials or symbolism in them. So at Çatalhöyük, it is not the case that the more elaborate houses are also the biggest houses. And for example, if we plot here the elaboration of the house from the least elaborate to the most elaborate, and then we plot the numbers of figurines, we find there is no relationship. And this is found with everything we do. It's not the case that the most elaborate houses with most symbolism or with most burial have most artifacts or the most rich artifacts or the highest status artifacts. And the same is true of production. So this is some work of the archaeobotanical team looking at the distribution of stored food, stored cereals in different houses. And again, there is no relationship between how elaborate a house is and how much storage it has and what type of storage it has. So what this shows very clearly at Çatalhöyük is that there are differences in the houses. There are some houses which are more symbolic and they have more burial and they last for longer periods of time. But these socio-ritual houses are not able to convert their ritual status into economic status. So they're not able to control production. So these more elaborate houses that control ritual are not able to control production, control storage, and to have bigger houses. So in my view, Çatalhöyük is a very interesting type of society which prevents a real hierarchy emerging. It's stopping, it's preventing status from emerging. So I call it an aggressively egalitarian society. It's aggressively stopping certain people becoming rich in economic terms. So the question is, how is it possible to organize 8,000 people if you don't have real hierarchy, if you don't have leaders who control production and control society outside the ritual area? And in order to answer that question, I want to start by looking at this particular building, which is Building 80 in the southern part of the site. And this is a view of Building 80. The walls are very well preserved. It's slightly burnt, but these are the white platforms in the north with the burials and so on. And in the south here you have the entrance and the hearths and ovens. And on this wall here is a painting that we gradually uncovered. And you can see that it has these vertical lines and triangles, and this sort of brick pattern that goes zigzag up between these lines. This one that I've just shown you, we found in this building here, building 80. This is supposed to be a plan of the southern part of Çatalhöyük. There are lots and lots of buildings here, and on the other side of the excavation area there is this painting in another building that again has vertical lines and triangles and this brick pattern. So it seems very likely that there is some connection. These people knew about each other, they saw each other. There's some sort of relationship between these two buildings. But the buildings are not by each other. They're at opposite ends of the excavation area. So they're separated from each other by a large number of other houses. And of course there are many other types of symbolism at Çatalhöyük. So we can look at other paintings, and we can look at bull's horns and benches of bull's horns and the different types, the leopards and the other types of symbolism, and we can connect all the houses that have these different symbols. And what we find is a real mess, like this. Lots of sort of connections of different types of symbolism, different types of art, and so on, between the different buildings. It's not the case that nearby buildings have a similar appearance. We also know, as I said before, we also know that some buildings, like this one, have more burials than others, whereas other buildings have no burials. So it seems likely that people were burying their dead into these the main burial houses that I talked about before. So one of the types of connections between people at Çatalhöyük was in terms of the circulation of the dead, the taking of parts of bodies, circulating them, and then burying them in particular houses. So we have lots of different types of connection here that are making a very, very complex network of people, connected mainly by social and ritual factors. Another very fascinating type of connection is to do with the circulation of humans. So we have been trying very hard for a long time to use ancient DNA to really understand the relationship between people at Çatalhöyük. But unfortunately it's become very difficult to extract ancient DNA from the bones at Çatalhöyük because of the very bad preservation. And perhaps because of the way the bodies were left out before they were buried. Mehmet Somel at ODTÜ is doing very important work and has a new program to try and get ancient DNA from the bones at Çatalhöyük, and I'm very hopeful that will produce exciting results. But until his work is completed, what the Human Remains team has done at Çatalhöyük is to use teeth, very detailed measurements of teeth, in order to use teeth as a proxy for genetic relationships, so that because there is good evidence that when people are closely related genetically, they have very similar markers on their teeth that you can measure. And so what the team did at Çatalhöyük was to take the teeth from a series of buildings and then look to see how similar the teeth were as a proxy for genetic relationships. And what they found was very unexpected, because we had assumed that the people who were buried in a house were a family in some sense, what we mean by a family, a nuclear family. But in fact, we didn't find that. We found that the people buried in the houses are from diverse, different genetic backgrounds. And the way that the team has interpreted that is that after birth at Çatalhöyük, children were farmed out or fostered out or given out to other houses in the community. So you would be born in one house, but you would grow up in another house. So there was a real mixing, a genetic mixing that occurred. And there are ethnographic societies today where this type of thing happens, this sort of fostering out. And of course what it leads to is an incredible sort of sense of you don't know who you're really related to. It's so that the whole community is just one family. Everybody is your brother and sister. You're all related in some way. You have multiple parents. It's a very, very tightly knit type of approach that creates very strong connections between houses and between different parts of the community. So when we look at this is a rather exaggerated image of Çatalhöyük, but it gives you the sense that there's a lot of people that have to be living together and somehow organized. And in my view, the way that this community was organized was largely through the development of these very strong ritual systems and these very strong social systems that tied people together so that they managed to organize themselves without any central authority. They had organizational rules, no doubt, set out by religious leaders of various sorts, but these were not religious leaders that somehow controlled the total economic production and distribution of goods within the settlement. This was all carried out by this very dense network of connections, so that any particular individual living in one of these houses had a huge amount of complex network relationships that they can call upon if they run into problems. So if you have a lack of food here, you have this great network of people that you can relate to and interact with. If there are problems, then you can refer to a great network of support within this community. So it's a type of society that I think we've rather lost, but is, I think, very interesting. The final aspect of Çatalhöyük that I want to talk about, how our ideas have changed, is perhaps one of the most famous images from Çatalhöyük, which is often termed the mother goddess. And certainly many people have interpreted this in terms of the Kibali type notion, and it's undoubtedly the case that at Çatalhöyük there are these beautiful images from a number of different contexts. When our team started working on this material in the 90s and the 2000s, one of the things that they noticed most clearly was that in fact none of the figurines that we were excavating are found in special contexts. They're not found on altars or on platforms or in special places. They're just found in rubbish. The vast majority were thrown away as rubbish, and they seem to have been made quite quickly, and they don't seem to be of any great significance. And so the idea of a goddess didn't seem to really fit, and very few of them are shown in mothering positions, and so the idea of a mother goddess didn't seem to fit either. And so there was a real attempt by the team to deconstruct the idea of the mother goddess, and instead there was a focus on looking more carefully at the nature of these bodies, and the team felt that what was really being shown here was older women, and they talk about emphasizing buttocks, flattened or drooping breasts, and stomachs. So these sort of drooping stomachs, drooping parts of the bodies all suggested to them that these were middle-aged to older women, and that what was being celebrated here was not a mother goddess as such, but mature women. And this was something that was linked to isotopic work on the human remains at Çatalhöyük, and what that showed was that there were clear differences in age between the diets of the people buried beneath the floors at Çatalhöyük. So this is nitrogen and carbon, and these are the isotopes from the bones, and these open symbols are the younger adults, and the darker symbols are the middle-aged and older adults. And you can see that on the whole the younger ones are all over here and the older ones are all over there. And so it does seem that Çatalhöyük was divided to some extent, because diet is a very clear indication of status. So Çatalhöyük was divided, but largely by age, so that it was older people had greater status and importance. And the idea is that this is also true of women, that older women were accorded a lot of status along with older men. And the diets of men and women overall are identical. So there is no evidence that men and women had different diets, and there is no evidence that men and women had different jobs in life, that the types of work they did were very different. So men and women were very, very similar. So it was a very egalitarian society in terms of male and female, as well as being egalitarian in terms of social hierarchy. But the difference that we do see is in terms of age, so that all older people, both men and women, had status, and the older I'm having to move on quickly because my battery is running out. So this is a figurine we found recently, found in fact by Eric Marciniak in the upper levels of Çatalhöyük, which I think shows a woman, but may show a sort of sumo wrestler type man. Really a beautiful, beautiful object. And this was found placed carefully on a platform. And so one does begin to wonder whether right at the end of the occupation at Çatalhöyük that there were these very special objects that were made that were placed in special positions, and that maybe, here we go round in the circle again, that we spent a long time trying to argue against the idea of the mother goddess, but maybe in the end there is something to the idea that at the end of the end of Çatalhöyük, in the latest levels, that there was some special status given to some women in Çatalhöyük. So maybe Melot was again, as often, right in the end. And so I just want to end by again thanking the British Institute at Ankara and a number of other supporters of the project over a long period of time. And I would particularly like to thank both the Turkish Ministry of Culture and Tourism. But I think it's very important to recognize that without the support of the commercial sponsors, the Yapı Kredi, Boeing, Shell and Koçtaş, and in fact many others over the years, but particularly these ones that have stayed on board with us over this period of time, that we couldn't have done the work without their continued long-term funding. So thank you to them, and thank you to you for listening.
Thank you very much, Ian. I think we'll keep the microphone so that questions also can be translated. I'm sure that after this very wonderful summary of all the results you have of over 25 years, I think that there are going to be many more than 25 questions. So, but let's start. You're prepared to.
Yeah.
Please. All right, the gentleman in the white shirt at the back.
Just a very basic question, Professor. Do we know what happened to Çatalhöyük? How do people deserted this location, or like an earthquake, or a great fire, or invasion, more, I don't know, like...
So the question is whether we know why the site was left and what the reasons were behind the fact that the site was left are.
So I've been talking about the eastern mound at Çatalhöyük, and there was a continuation of the settlement onto the west mound for another sort of 500 or so years. And at that time also there was a large number of a large number of settlements that emerged on the Konya plain. So at the time of the main Çatalhöyük, Çatalhöyük is the only site. But as we go through time, there is an expansion of population. And so my main idea is that people expanded in population, they moved outwards and moved to the west, but also to other sites.
Yes, please.
Could you tell me why do you think there's a correlation between the Taurus Mountains? And perhaps because the site is quite close to the range of mountains, isn't it? The Taurus Mountains.
So what's the question?
Is there a connection between the Taurus Mountains and the site? Because the Taurus Mountains run from, I think it runs all the way to Kavaklıdere as well. It runs along the southern coast.
The question is whether there is a correlation between the location of Çatalhöyük and the Taurus Mountain.
No, considering the bull, because Taurus.
And the Taurus mountain range, especially in light of the decoration that is found often in many of the houses, being a bull's head.
Yeah, people have written about that. So they've argued that there is some link between the bull at Çatalhöyük and the bull at other sites and the idea of the Taurus mountains. I don't myself think there is anything to that. It's certainly true that at Çatalhöyük there was extensive use of the mountains. For example, a lot of the flint used for stone tools and so on, the chert, it comes from the Taurus, and there was use of wood and many other resources. But I think the idea of the bull is a very, very generic, widespread idea that goes through many millennia. All societies like bulls, symbolically. And so I think it's difficult to say there's a specific link. Yes, but, yeah, exactly, yes.
Yes, please.
What do you know about public space and public life?
So the question is, what do we know about public space and public life? So it's very interesting that Çatalhöyük does not have any public space in the sense of a big open plaza or area like that. There is nothing. All the ground penetrating radar on the other approaches we've done only show houses and areas of rubbish. The areas of rubbish have a range of activities on, but they're not public activities in the sense of large collections of people. They're really individual activities. So some people have argued that the roofs acted as a public space, but I'm not convinced of that, because when we have found roof material collapsed into houses, they're always completely clean. There's no clear evidence that people were using roofs a lot for a range of activities. And I think the roofs were very divided up by second stories and so on. So the art shows collections of people teasing and baiting wild animals. That cannot have happened at Çatalhöyük, because there's nowhere to do that. So I think that the only public space was outside the settlement, where people must have had rituals of various sort, including teasing, baiting, and killing and feasting on wild animals.
The gentleman in the grey? Yes, yes.
Can I ask two questions?
Short one.
The short one is, how did 21st century technology contributed to your archaeology in general? And the second question is, do you have any correlation between agriculture and emergence of Çatalhöyük?
So just to do the second one quickly, Çatalhöyük is quite a long time. Quite a long time after the initial domestication of plants and animals. although cattle are domesticated about the same time as Çatalhöyük. But Çatalhöyük shows a lot of agricultural innovation, but it's not associated with the first domestication. Your first question, I could talk a lot about that. Our work at Çatalhöyük has changed completely as a result of using digital techniques. As I showed, we no longer dig with tapes and measures and paper and pencil. It's all done digitally using photography and virtual 3D reconstruction and GIS and so on. It's all done on tablets, and we have a very, very large database. And so everything has changed, and in my view it's changed for the better, because what it means is that if you're sitting in your trench and you're recording, you have on your tablet all the data from Çatalhöyük. You can bring up pictures and images and other records. So you live in a data-rich environment in a way that you didn't before. So it's very exciting, and if any of you can manage it, I would encourage you to go to Istanbul to Anamed in İstiklal Caddesi. There is a wonderful exhibit now about the techniques of Çatalhöyük, and particularly about the digital techniques. And you can put on goggles, and you can go into Çatalhöyük and walk around Çatalhöyük. And all of the digital techniques are explained. It's a really wonderful exhibit, and I hope it might come to Ankara at some point.
Yes, the last question. Yes, for you.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. I was wondering, were there any new phytolith works going to be done on Çatalhöyük?
Did you say phytolith? Yeah. Yes. Are there new phytolith work? Yes. So we've just exported, I think, 200 boxes of phytolith material to go to specialists abroad, and so there'll be a lot more new results that come out from that. But it's already been very productive. The information we get from phytoliths is very different from the information we get from the macrobotanical remains, and it's been a real insight, particularly if you're trying to identify the details of daily activities in houses. Very important.
One question, please.
Oh, there are four questions. Four more questions.
But you said 25, so this is 18.
All right, you got the point there. Yes.
How do you protect the site? Because, as you know, in 2010 there was one statue was stolen from Kavaklıdere. So how do you protect? I mean, how do you control this kind of incidents in Çatalhöyük?
Yeah, we obviously take that very seriously,
okay.
And there are full-time guards at Çatalhöyük. We also have a closed-circuit television system across the whole mound now, so anybody that moves anywhere on the mound, it's all visible and recorded and so on. And so, yeah, there's lots of security measures that we just make sure that it doesn't happen. The other very important thing is to work with the local community so that they feel part of the site and that they also protect the site.
What happens now?
What happens now? Well,
you're leaving, aren't you?
I've now finished excavating at Çatalhöyük, but we're hoping that a new team will take over.
Who'll take care?
What?
Who'll take care?
Yeah,
We're hoping someone will take care. It's
early days.
Yeah, the ministry has to decide this.
Yes.
You gave the name.
Well, there's a process.
I think the lady in the back.
You're not going to get me to say it.
The lady in the back.
You can try, but it won't work. What, sorry?
There in the back.
Yeah.
My question goes to theory. You know, the primary function of these clay balls, the famous ones, relates to heat transfer, you know, for roasting meat, and it's all about the context because they were found in your works nearby the ovens. Very similar, in modern terms, was observed in Mongolia with these amorphous balls, and these were also used as tanders, for roasting meat. This is my question. Have you ever tried to establish a link with the far distant geographies through an anthropological lens?
Do you mean, so you're asking whether we've tried to connect Turkey with Mongolia?
No, with the modern music. That's not just an example. Similar practices are all around Anatolia,
Yes.
That was a distant,
Yes, sorry, I didn't understand. Yes.
Geography.
Yes, so Sonia Atalay, I don't know if you sound like you might know her work. She did a PhD on the clay balls, and she did both experimental work and did ethnographic work. But most of the ethnographic work I think she did was in North America, comparing with Native American groups. If it's the case that you think we should look for ethnographic parallels in Turkey, I'd be delighted to do that. You can let me know about it.
All right, one last question maybe.
If my memory doesn't fail me, the old idea was Çatalhöyük supposed to be epicenter of vast web of obsidian trade. What happened to that old idea?
That died, that idea. So the question was about the obsidian trade and whether Çatalhöyük was at the center of some obsidian network. When you actually work it out, the amount of obsidian that came to Çatalhöyük was very, very little. I mean, when you dig at the site, it seems like there's a lot, but that's over 1,000 years. And if you work it out, it's actually very, very little. And so there is no evidence that Çatalhöyük had any special role in the distribution of obsidian.
What do you think?
It's up to you.
Your battery gave up. So,
But, yes.
Okay, one last question without battery, but that's the very last one then.
On these female figurines, mature or older female figurines, would you ever like to consider, as Çatalhöyük society is deeply interested with their past, getting their dead back and reburying them? These figurines might, do you think, as they appear to me like, no offense, voodoo dolls, might be the implication of a wish for a future making, a reproduction, or a possibility of older women to get pregnant and make a future, build in a future?
That's a very interesting idea. So the question is whether the figurines at Çatalhöyük somehow represent a quest for reproductive success in the future.
Yes, and build a future.
Yeah, I mean the trouble is that we can sit around and have lots of different ideas about what these represent. As an archaeologist, we have to have some contextual evidence, and at the moment, I can't say there is any good contextual evidence that would allow us to say that. And so what we need to look at more carefully is to look at where these things are deposited, when they're deposited. For example, I have an idea they may be related to the dead and to some link between women and the dead that I don't really understand, but I have a suggestion that might be a link. So we need to look very carefully to see if there is any link like that. Or in terms of your question, is there any evidence of more figurines being found in a period of low fertility, because we can measure fertility. So is it possible that more of these figurines are found in periods of low fertility? So that would be a way of testing your idea and going further with it. We just need to look at those sorts of links, the evidence.
All right, thank you very much, all of you as well, for asking questions. I now have the pleasure of thanking people. First of all, Jennifer, thank you for the introduction. Then also TBA for letting us use their wonderful facilities. Last but not least, of course, Ian, thank you very much for this wonderful lecture. And I think that many of us would like to continue talking about the lecture, but we can do that by with a glass of wine and some things to eat with a glass of wine on the other side of the building. So thank you for coming, and please join us at the reception.